My name is Richard Moore. I'm with Lionel Birnie.
Hello, Richard.
And Daniel Friebe.
Hello, chaps. No, can we do that again?
Nope.
The Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Interviews and analysis. We've got the big talking points covered.
Daniel, as usual, has got a dog-eared copy of L'Equipe on his lap. He's sort of scattering, dropping pages of newspaper everywhere he goes. Sadly, Lionel doesn't have a pint of beer in front of him this week, which is a shame because we felt that added quite a lot to last week's podcast. And there have been a lot of requests, Lionel, for us to ply you with alcohol for future podcasts as well.
Lionel, you dress like an Inuit. It's about 10 degrees and you've got how many layers? 5?
3 layers. It was a cycling club end of season bash last night, so I may still be drunk.
That's encouraging, because we're hoping that US marketing guy who made an appearance in last week's podcast, it was New York marketing guy, there are a few requests for him to reappear this week, so I think he might reappear when we're talking about the Tour de France route, which has been announced this week. Christian Prudhomme in Paris revealed the route for the 2015 Tour de France. He described it as an untypical route. I think it's fair to say we agree with that, although what's a typical Tour de France route these days? Don't really know. Controversially, only 14 kilometres of individual time trialling. Lionel punching the air. The climbing comes pretty late on in the race. There's some interesting stages in the first week. And it's already generated a little bit of controversy thanks to Chris Froome putting out a statement within minutes of the announcement of the route, suggesting that he may not ride the Tour and instead ride the Vuelta and the Giro. That's definitely not going to happen, I don't think. I mean, I've said things with utter certainty before. I'm pretty sure that is not going to happen. And it was interesting that there was no one from Team Sky at the official presentation. That was quite a snub, really, wasn't it, Lionel?
Well, they went sailing, didn't they? They had an away day with the British sailing team down off the south coast of England. Lots of pictures on social media from various Sky people. Dave Brailsford in a sou'wester. I don't think he was in a sou'wester, but he was at the helm of some little sailing boat, and they were obviously having a great team building, and it did look as if that was orchestrated a little bit. It did look like it was a snub, as you say, Richard, rather than just an unfortunate clash. I'm sure British sailing would have been available on another day had Chris Froome wanted to go to the team the race presentation in Paris.
Could they not have sailed over the channel to the presentation? Well, that would have been a fitting way to pay homage to the Tour de France, wouldn't it?
Yeah, they could have sailed into...
And then cycled to Paris.
Sailed into Le Havre and then cycled down to Paris for the presentation. I think, they should have done that, definitely.
They definitely should have. Chris Froome looked like he was really enjoying it, actually. I mean, he was sitting there in the boat looking happy as Larry. But it was all a little bit odd. But let's talk about the route. We'll maybe return to Froome a bit later on. We knew it was starting Utrecht, of course, for the first time in Holland. And then making its way across the north of France. We've got another cobbled stage this year, second year in a row. We'll have cobbles, and that in itself is interesting, of course. Weather was a big factor in this year's drama on the cobbled stage, so we don't know what that will throw up. The cobbles come quite late on in the stage, they're on the final 30 kilometres, I think.
And it's a long stage, 221 kilometres, so it will be a completely different type of challenge to this year's, which was a lot of cobbles, more cobbles, but on a very short, more explosive stage, wasn't it?
Well, actually, in the end, there weren't more cobbles, I don't think, were there? Because they lost quite a couple of sections thanks to the weather, so it ended up being about the same number of cobbles, but I think that it was the weather that made it the stage that it was. That contributed an awful lot to that stage. But Daniel, what are your impressions of the Tour? I'm thinking that you will be particularly pleased about the return of time bonuses.
Well, yeah, just thinking about that, with a 14-kilometre time trial to kick things off in Utrecht, we can expect probably Tony Martin to take the yellow jersey there. If he's riding, it would be a fair bet, wouldn't it? 14 kilometres should just about be long enough for him to be the favourite.
Are we going to predict the winner of every stage?
Yeah, and then I think we'd like to see Marcel Kittel win the first stage and get the 10 seconds bonus. But is 10 seconds enough to get the jersey? I mean, he's already had it twice before, so it's maybe not that much of a priority.
As you point out in your excellent piece in Pro Cycling, the new Pro Cycling, Daniel, you've sort of done a piece about Kittel, Cavendish, Buhani, talking about the sort of preeminent sprinters. You do mention in that Kittel did start off as a time trialist, so could he perhaps try and pull out a good time trial in Utrecht to be in a good position to take the yellow jersey? I mean, Mark Cavendish can do a decent time trial as well.
I mean, it will be close, but that is probably going to be the last opportunity for those guys to... or Cavendish could certainly do a good 14-kilometre time trial, but that is going to be the one and only opportunity, I fear, because the next day they go to the Mur de Huy, which is, of course, we all know as the traditional finale of Flèche Wallonne. Lionel, I'm imagining you probably feel like me that the Mur de Huy is probably fine in the Tour de France, but it wouldn't have been... I wouldn't have been too disappointed if yesterday Christian Prudhomme had announced that it was no longer going to be the finale of Flèche Wallonne, that it's about time that they moved away from there.
Yeah, I think we made that point in the spring when we were talking about the classics, that it's time for a refresh of those, particularly the Liège, Bastogne-Liège and Flèche Wallonne finishes, because we're getting very samey outcomes year after year. But the Mur de Huy it's a great climb. It's a real sort of... It's almost a stadium climb, isn't it? You can get a lot of fans on there. It's got a really sort of iconic Z-bend in the middle. It's very steep. If you've ridden it, you'll know exactly how steep it is. It's a real tiny gear grind.
Obviously you've ridden it then.
I have, yeah. I mean, gravity is not my best friend when it comes to cycling, but even for good cyclists, it's a real test of judgment. As we see in Flèche Wallonne, year on year, it comes down to who times their move and who has the nerve to wait to the very end and wait for that last sort of 200 to 300 metres really to make their last gasp sprint for the line.
Yeah, and also crucially, who is in a decent position coming into the bottom of the Mur de Huy. I mean, just looking at the results of Flèche Wallonne this year, Nairo Quintana was down in I think 53rd place. So if you imagine, a scenario whereby someone wins by 4 or 5 seconds and gets a 10-second bonus, then one of the general classification contenders might well be sort of stuffed in that kind of bottleneck further down the climb and could conceivably lose 30 seconds there.
I think we'll probably, assuming they don't change the finish of Flèche Wallonne for 2015, I think we'll see all the big hitters riding that race, won't we, to get a bit of a tryout for the Tour. Who's going to win that stage then, Daniel? Dan Martin?
Well, I was speaking to a friend of the podcast, Matt Rabin, the chiropractor at Garmin Shop, because I've had a bit of an injury this week, and he was helping me out with that, and he immediately said it's a great tour for Dan Martin. He's obviously not going to win it, is he? No offence to Dan Martin, but he's not going to win the tour.
So it's a great tour for Dan Martin because there's a couple of hilltop finishes.
Presumably, yeah.
There's a lot of climbing. In the tour. It is a tour for climbers. So shall we move along through northern France? It finishes in the stage. It finishes in a city I know extremely well, Amiens, a place I visit regularly. It's not been there for a while, the tour, but it's a historic city with a beautiful cathedral in the centre. And as I mentioned, we're a long time till we get to the major climbing, and also an awful long time until we get to the team time trial, stage 9. That's a controversial inclusion. I mean, teams will have lost riders by that point. There's no question. I mean, the team time trial normally comes stage 3 or 4, doesn't it?
Well, not only that, but it's got a little kick in the tail at the end, the Côte de Cadoudal, which is not a long climb, it's not a particularly steep climb, but assuming that we haven't seen all the details of the rules, but assuming that the time for each team will be taken as the 5th man over the line, that's going to make it a challenging enough stage. I mean, there will be climbers and people who are more comfortable on that climb, team leaders I'm thinking of, who will really be sort of hamstrung by their 5th best rider on the day, more so than if the run-in and the finish was completely on the flat.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the likelihood of there being time gaps on the Mur de Huy. There's also the Mur de Bretagne, the day before the team time trial. Again, we could see 30 seconds there. So, and of course, there's a cobbles stage. I mean, we talk about the big 4 now. Oleg Tinkov has kind of forced us to talk about the big 4 of Quintana, Nibali, Contador and Froome. We could conceivably see maybe a 3-minute gap between the first and the last of those 4 before we go into this team time trial stage. But as regards the team time trial, Christian Prudhomme pointed out that the last team time trial in Nice, so that was 2013, wasn't it? For the majority of the teams, not all of the riders were actually doing turns at the front. They were, protecting, shielding. Maybe the weaker time trial, it's all their GC riders. So there's been a lot of talk about teams maybe losing riders in the first week through crashes, accidents, etc. And there might be teams with only 5, 6, 7 guys left. Shouldn't be too much of a problem if we take that into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, it's still. I'm assuming there won't be some kind of weird challenge from the UCI, because it does fall outside of the strict regulation on the placing of a team time trial in a Grand Tour. It's a little bit too late. It's on day 9 of the race, stage 9, just before the rest day, which is on the second Monday.
Presumably they've checked it before they did the glitzy presentation in Paris. Presumably they ran that by the UCI, you would have thought, wouldn't you? It would be slightly awkward now if the UCI were to throw the rule book at them.
Well, if they didn't, it would be it's unlikely the UCI are going to throw the rule book at them and say, no, you've got to move it, I'm afraid. You've got to move it back to the Thursday.
Oh, this isn't New York. Hang on. This is a new character. Well, yeah, I mean, it's the kind of innovation that New York marketing guy might like for the Tour de France franchise, no? Tour de franchise.
Yeah, yes.
But I mean, these aspects of it, the lateness, the fact that the cobbled stage appears before, it's going to influence the outcome of the team time trial, and the time gaps, as you say, are probably going to be greater. There are going to be, say Nibali or Froome or somebody loses valuable lieutenants, say Geraint Thomas crashes on the cobbles and is out of the race or something like that. The teams could be seriously weakened, and that could have a bearing on the outcome of the race.
Well, undoubtedly. Sorry, Daniel. I mean, but this is one of the great things about the way the Tour de France route plotting has evolved in recent years, since Christian Prudhomme took the helm in, I think, 2007, although that wouldn't have been his first race that he plotted, would it? But from 2008 onwards, certainly got rid of the prologue, he got rid of the time bonuses, he had stages opening the race with a road stage with an uphill finish. Just basically the trend that he's trying to counter is the big riders waiting for a handful of key strategic mountain stages and turning the 14 days before you get to the decisive final week into a bit of a procession in terms of the general classification riders. And as we saw last year, it perhaps from a grand storytelling point of view, it backfired a little bit because Contador and Froome both crashed out relatively early. But it means that the story of the race starts from day one, and I don't think there's any problem with that. They've all got to be in the right place at the right time, and we know for a fact that somebody will lose either their team leader and all hope of winning the yellow jersey, or a team leader will lose some really important domestiques.
Okay, shall we leave it in van? You mentioned there, Lionel, of riders waiting for a few key decisive moments in the mountains. Reminds me of Lance Armstrong, and we're going to talk about him a little bit later, aren't we? But Daniel, you had something to talk about.
Yeah, just about that, Lionel, the story of the race starting on day one. We've mentioned the steep uphill finishes, we've mentioned the time trial, the team time trial, but there are 2 stages there as well which throw up the possibility of some nasty windy weather on the coast. The first stage to Zeeland, still in Holland, that is, isn't it? And then also the stage from Abbeville to Le Havre, and there's also a nasty climb near the end of that stage at Le Havre. So I'm sure, I think there's a very high likelihood that we'll see someone with an interest in the general classification have problems or perhaps even crash out, unfortunately, in that first week.
This is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast with Richard Moore, Lionel Birnie and Daniel Friebe.
Okay, fellas, we've caught our flights from Brittany down to Pau, as if we'll be driving that huge distance. There's a massive transfer. It's basically the length of France, isn't it?
Isn't that more or less the Zimmerman route? Was the very famously Richard mentioned in probably several of your acclaimed tomes, no?
Actually, only mentioned it in one, Daniel, Étape. The story of Zimmerman, who in 1992 he'd had enough hanging about with cyclists, so he didn't want to get the plane with them all and opted to take a team car instead with the mechanics.
Similar route, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a very similar route, and it went to Pau, and he he was disqualified from the race, thrown off the race for not taking the official mode of transport. He was reinstated on appeal, but he was waiting. The excuse was that he was scared of flying, but strangely he was waiting at the airport to fly home when he learned of his reprieve. So there was slightly more to that story. You might have to buy the book to find out.
Maybe we could recreate that for the cycling podcast, kind of Phoenix from the Flames. We could meet Zimmerman in Brittany and we could do the drive with him.
Or we could persuade one of the riders not to get the plane and drive with us and see if they get disqualified. No?
Starting to sound a bit like Top Gear here, isn't it? Somebody's flying, somebody's driving, somebody's going on a pedalo.
Well, Team Sky are sailing, I think, that route. So yeah, that could be interesting. Captain Froome, if he's not riding the Tour, that is, he'll be in his little life jacket. Admiral Brailsford.
Of course, Vino was wearing that kind of very nautical get-up at the Tour last year, wasn't he? With the Admiral's cap.
He was. Right. Anyway, so we've landed in Pau, somewhere we go every year. Nice place in the Pyrenees. And Daniel, you can maybe talk us through these days in the Pyrenees, because you know the mountains extremely well.
Well, the first stage is a summit finish at La Pierre Saint-Martin. It finishes right on the Spanish border on Bastille Day. I think I'm right in saying. Am I right in saying Bastille Day? Yeah, it is. And it's a very flat stage with a single climb. The climb is effectively the north side of the Col de Soude. A fairly steady climb. There are some tricky bits in the middle, some fairly steep ramps, but we've seen these stages in the past few years, haven't we? The stage with the long run in and one climb as a summit finish, they do tend to cause quite a lot of damage. I remember the stage of La Mongie in 2004, where it was an absolute bloodbath, if you'll excuse the double entendre. So that should be quite eventful. And then the next stage is the one to Courtrai over the Espana and the Tourmalet. It's a route we know well now, certainly over those two climbs. And then Courtrai is not a steep uphill finish. It's not a long uphill finish at all. This is the first of what I think are going to be some fairly crucial, could be some crucial descents on the Tour route, which Nibali will certainly be looking keenly at. That side of the Tourmalet down to Luz Saint-Sauveur is quite nasty. So he, you never know, might look to take advantage there. And then the 12th stage to Plateau de Bay is a real horror. It's an important day on the King of the Mountains competition. Multiple climbs. Porte d'Aspet, where of course Fabio Casatelli tragically died in 1995. It's a very steep climb, never mind the descent. Then the Col de la Cour, the Porte de l'Eure, and the Plateau de Bay, which is a real horror of a climb. Hot, sticky, long, and quite steep. I think it's about 17 kilometres long. So that's, for my money, probably the hardest stage in the Tour, actually.
Do you call that the Queen stage then, Daniel, or is that a term that you reject?
No, I mean, I would suggest that is probably one of the hardest stages in the race. And also, it's going to be a tactically interesting stage as well, because there's some quite long valleys. In spite of the sort of quick succession of climbs, there are actually some long valleys between the Col de la Cour and even to the foot of Plateau de Bay. I remember Mark Cavendish having a pretty nasty time a couple of years ago, the last time we went to Plateau de Bay, in that same valley, and I think he caught back on there. He was in danger of missing the time limit. But that is somewhere where riders could come unstuck. We'll probably see teammates going down the road, domestiques going down the road to support their leaders before the foot of Plateau de Bay on that stage.
Mention of King of the Mountains reminds us that this next year's tour will be the 40th anniversary of the polka dot jersey, which was introduced in 1975 and won by Lucien Van Impe, who I think won King of the Mountains 7 times. Is that correct? So I think he holds the record with Richard Virenque. I'll check that in a moment. Daniel reaches for his phone, but yeah, the mop-haired, sort of mop of curly hair. A bit like Daniel, actually, quite a doppelganger, Lucien Van Impe and Daniel, but he's a Belgian climber who I frequently describe as Dutch.
Incorrectly, obviously.
Incorrect.
Yeah. One little thing about the polka dot jersey. I don't know, Daniel, Richard, you might have looked into this. Is the story true? The origins of the jersey design, with the white with the red dots on. Was it Félix Levitin? Was watching a 6-day race in Paris, and one of the jerseys in the 6-day race was a very similar design, and then the Poulain chocolate company came to them as a potential sponsor, and they had a chocolate that was wrapped in a similar type of paper, white with the red dots on, and that's how the polka dot jersey was introduced.
I don't know, but I do know that Lucien Van Impe only actually won it 6 times, not 7. I'm getting confused with another 7-time winner of another competition in the Tour, former 7-time winner. He won it 6 times. But yeah, do you know the origins of the polka dot jersey?
I read this recently, Lionel, and I've forgotten. As regards Van Impe, just one point on Van Impe, often celebrated as one of the greatest climbers of all time, not for my money, quite overrated. If you speak to people who raced in that era. He
famously, the year that he won the Tour de France in 1976, he won because Guimard basically told him when to attack and threatened to run him off the road if he didn't attack. He wasn't the most sort of
a notoriously defensive rider, wasn't he?
Defensive. He wasn't exactly Mr. Panache. One thing on that book though, the Geoffrey Nicholson a book on the 1976 Tour de France, the great bicycle race, he mentions the polka dot jersey a little bit in that and describes it as an absolute aberration, a disgrace, and just something that he thought wouldn't catch on, wouldn't be persisted with, because he just thought it was a bit of an eyesore.
But it's become a real iconic symbol of cycling, really. Just on Lucien Van Impe, went to his house once. He wasn't in, unfortunately. We'd made an arrangement to visit him, but he'd gone out, presumably forgotten. But his house is called Alpe d'Huez.
Nice knowledge, Daniel.
Another thing on Van Impe, when he won the Tour de France, I think I'm right in saying they had to smuggle him back into his house in the boot of his car. There were so many people camped on the front lawn, I think.
Moving on then, across
Is he the last Belgian winner of the Tour? He is the last Belgian winner of the Tour, yeah. Moving across into the Massif Central, and we've got a stage that finishes in Mende. That's always provided quite an interesting finish. I mentioned in a piece I wrote that in 2010, when we finished at Mende, Alberto Contador, I don't think he won the stage, but he certainly attacked on that climb and caused a little bit of damage. And it's a brutal little climb up to a sort of airfield, isn't it? And it's really tough roads around there as well. I mean, that year I remember Bradley Wiggins was off the back at one point. I think he crashed or he had a mechanical problem. He was off the back and he was worried at one point he wouldn't get back on. He said it was an absolute ferocious stage, and those kind of roads can often encourage, can just be really unrelenting and difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of stage that you can imagine, if Alberto Contador needs to make up time, it's the kind of stage that his team and his certainly management of his team might look to exploit. In 1995, which of course is the famous stage to it was the famous stage to Mende on Bastille Day. Laurent Jalabert won at the end of a breakaway of I think getting on for 200 kilometres. His Once team really ripped Benesto, Miguel Indurain's Benesto team apart, but Bjarne Riis, who's Contador's team manager, he was very prominent that day as well, chasing with Indurain behind Laurent Jalabert.
You're listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Tweet us at cycling_podcast.
Okay, so we're into the Alps, but just before we get to the Alps, Lionel, you were very annoyed, weren't you, at the fact that the route was leaked in advance, as it is every year. That you were particularly irritated by this year. Why was that?
Well, I'm no more irritated than I was last year and the year before. This is a recent thing, actually, the route getting completely leaked. And Richard and I had an email exchange in which we had a difference of opinion about the merits of... There's a Dutch blogger whose website is VeloWire. I mean, I commend him on the thorough work he does over a sort of 3-4 months period, where he said in an interview that basically gets home from work every day and spends the evening on the phone to tourist boards and hotels, and he's got a network of people who send him information from local newspapers, and he pieces together the route. Personally, I think it takes a little bit of the surprise and the enjoyment out of the reveal. And Richard's point was that, journalism is about finding out things that people don't necessarily want you to know. My point is that ASO do want you to know the Tour de France route, but they'd like you to know it on the day that they reveal it for the first time, not 48 hours before. And this route goes through so many revisions, and it's like, it might finish here or it might finish there. And then basically 48 hours before the actual announcement, he kind of puts the last piece of the jigsaw into place and spoils it for everyone, in my opinion.
Well, Lionel, I've found a man after your own dark heart in L'Equipe, Philippe Bouvet, who is I suppose the longest-serving writer on the L'Equipe cycling desk, one of the historical plumes of L'Equipe. He wrote this morning, the quite puerile game of social networks slightly spoiled the innocent pleasure of the surprise, as though the Christmas present had been delivered without us having to undo the knots on the gift wrap.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. I mean, it's a bit like anything like this. Sport relies on a little bit of that magic and mystery. It's kind of sport on occasions can be like Christmas for grown-ups. The FA Cup draw has been just made worse over the years with a succession of marketing men ruining it, meddling it. Let's do the draw while the matches are still being played. I mean, and the Tour de France route unveil, it should be something where we basically see the route unfold before our eyes.
Lionel, I would put it to you, this is the present reality, and it's really up to the Grand Tour organisers, particularly the ASO, the Tour de France, to really adapt and find more ways to throw the Dutch gentleman that you spoke about off the scent, really. I don't think they've really taken stock of this being the reality now, and of social networks, etc., and of the way information is now disseminated, and I think that in future they just need to be a bit more careful.
But I think the principle is more important, that the job of journalism is to find stuff out, and I don't think you can say, well, you can find that kind of stuff out, but you can't find that kind of stuff out. I mean, I think that I'm not sure that it really matters in the grand scheme of things. I'd be more concerned if he was accurately predicting the podium, for example. I mean, it's just to me it doesn't really matter. In a lot of ways, it doesn't really spoil the great reveal. And actually, he got one or two things wrong this year. I think there was, at one point anyway, I saw that the team time trial was predicted for Amiens, which I was getting quite excited about, but that's not the case. So it's not perfect, and I think I'm not sure how you can control it, because locally people do find out that the Tour is coming. I mean, the local police, the councillors, they will know, they will tell people, and it spreads out like that as well. So I don't really have a huge problem with it. Anyway, on to the Alps. Daniel, do you want to talk us through the Alpine stages as well?
Okay, so we've got first stage into Gap, which is a kind of semi-alpine stage, medium mountain stage. I think I'm right in saying they go over the Col de Mons, is it, into Gap, which is where Alberto Contador attacked and gained valuable time in 2010, I think I'm right in saying. Andy Schleck had some problems on the descent. And then we've got a first alpine stage to Pralou, which is the ski resort where Eddy Merckx's Tour de France dynasty famously ended in 1975. Bernard Thévenet set up his overall victory there. The descent...
Was that where Merckx was punched?
That was at the Puy de Dôme earlier in that stage. The several interesting features in that stage, one of them being the Col d'Alos, being the penultimate climb there, but the descent off the Col d'Alos, Thévenet, who, as I mentioned, sort of ended Merckx's supremacy in the Tour de France that day, calls it the hardest descent in France, the descent off the Col d'Alos, straight down into the valley and up to Pralou. So that's something that, again, Nibali will be looking at with interest. I think the next day we've got the stage to Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne, which is an interesting one, with the Col de Glandon coming about 50 kilometres, 40 kilometres from the finish there. It's the easier side of the Glandon, but still quite a stiff climb, finishing at 1,924 metres. Then we've got a really exciting feature of this year's route, which is the Lacet de Montvernier, which you might have seen pictures of yesterday on Twitter. Very, very spectacular series of hairpins above the Maurienne Valley. Only climbs to 782 metres, so not high, but fairly steep, and a steep descent down into Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne. So that's the second stage in the Alps. The third stage finished at La Toussuire. We've got the Croix de Fer that day as well. And then the last stage in the Alps is it's a repeat of the very memorable, very spectacular 2011 stage, straight over the Galibier via the Telegraph, down again into the Maurienne Valley, and up to the Oisin Valley, not the Maurienne Valley, and then up to Alpe d'Huez.
That, as you mentioned, 2011. That was one of the most thrilling stages. Very short, as this year's is obviously. Very aggressive. It was the day after the Galibier stage that Andy Schleck won, which was a brutal stage, and there were some tired legs, and Alberto Contador really lit the fuse, didn't he? And it was one of those stages where, because it was so short, you could watch it in its entirety, and it was thrilling.
Yeah, it was, but it comes on the penultimate day this year. It will be interesting to see what lessons have been retained from that 2011 stage, because as spectacular as it was, it didn't really have the desired effect as far as Andy Schleck and Alberto Contador were concerned, and the rider who really benefited that day was Cadel Evans, who was prevented from really joining their attack because of a mechanical problem.
His head seemed to fall off. I mean, he was off his bike when there seemed to be nothing wrong with it. Tommy Vogler was stuck in no man's land, wasn't he? And it was that question. He was still in yellow. No, Andy Schleck was in. No, he was in yellow. Yeah. Sorry, Vogler was his last day in yellow, and he was caught. He had this dilemma of whether to sit up and go back to the group with Evans or to try and join the Andy Schleck, Alberto Contador group, and it was painful watching him sort of struggling with that dilemma. And physically struggling up the climb as well, and he paid for it in the end. His teammate Pierre Roland won the stage, didn't he? But it didn't, as you say, Daniel, it kind of set things up for Cadel Evans to take the yellow jersey the next day in Grenoble.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, depending on the scenario in the race, we might see the absolute opposite scenario, and we might see quite a sterile battle there, because it is 50 kilometres from the top of the Galibier to the foot of Alpe d'Huez. Another interesting feature about this year's race, well, I think two things. A lot of people have talked about how much it favours Quintana. I agree with that up to a point, that all of the summit finishes, or none of the summit finishes, are particularly steep. Alpe d'Huez is probably the steepest one. Also, the race only goes over 2,000 metres altitude on 4 occasions. Now, Quintana is someone who would who enjoys riding at high altitudes, and would probably have liked to have seen bigger climbs, a few more bigger climbs in the race.
I mean, the other riders it favours are the young French riders, Thibaut Pinot, Romain Bardet, with the lack of time trialling, the emphasis on climbing. As a few people have pointed out, this route has not been conjured up in the time since the Tour finished, and they had their breakthrough. Of course, that this route will have been in the planning stages for an awful lot longer than that. So it's not been tailor-made for those French riders, but nevertheless, it definitely looks like one that will meet with Pinot and Bardet's approval.
Yeah, I would agree with that, although we talked about the team time trial earlier, and the big four, their teams are all pretty good in that exercise. Movistar, Astana, Tinkoff, Saxo and Sky should all do well on that day. AG2R and FDJ probably less well. So they might struggle in that respect. Also, there's some nasty descents in there. I think Pinot exercised a few of his ghosts this year, but he might still be quite jittery on a couple of those harder ones we've mentioned. So we'll see. And also, obviously, the competition this year is going to be a lot stiffer. And can he live with that in that kind of company? We don't know yet.
And there are got to be questions as well about Pinot's mental strength, I think, have there? I mean, I remember an interview that we did during the Tour this year with Gilles Simon, the head of cycling at L'Equipe, who said then that finishing on the podium would be the worst thing that could happen to Pinot. This was midway through the Tour, that he felt that the best thing that could happen to him would be to finish fourth and not have that huge pressure. And you could already see in the photographs from the Tour presentation in Paris, Pinot was very much sort of centre stage, and already you can sense this great expectation around him, and it'll be interesting just to see how that affects him.
Well, yeah, it is a bit of a curse that they are so prominent, and particularly with such a sort of poor turnout of the stars in Paris for the presentation. The spotlight was even more intensely on them, and they don't have the luxury of doing what Chris Froome did, which is, we'll come on to discuss that now, I think, but Chris Froome, not being French, obviously, he can sort of throw in a curveball and make the suggestion that he's weighing up his options. I mean, personally, I thought it was a very odd thing to do. It's a bit like being invited to a cool party and just saying, I'm not sure I can make it. I might be doing something else that night. something I know, personal experience, obviously.
You're invited to a cool party, Lionel. Anyway, no.
I'm always invited, Richard. I just don't go.
You're just busy doing other things. No, it was very odd. It was, and the timing of it, was odd. It was so immediate after the announcement. And it was almost it was almost making a point to ASO. How dare you design such a course? And what's odd about that is that there's no question Froome is one of the best climbers in the world and the best all-round riders in the world. So, there is a time trial, there is a team time trial, but he's not somebody who's going to struggle in the mountains if he's in form, is he? Absolutely
not. And I mean, from the point of view of Sky, it's absolute madness to think that they wouldn't take their best rider. I mean, last year's Tour we had all the debate about Plan A and Plan B, but we really can't see them going to the Tour with Plan C.
And this is something we've seen going back over the years, riders issuing these empty threats. I remember before the 1998 Tour de France that Marco Pantani won, there were a lot of grumbles from him about the lack of climbing. I remember Mario Cipollini always at the Giro presentation complaining. I remember once he said it was more like a Giro of Italian ski resorts than a Giro d'Italia. So it's something we hear again and again. I'd be interested to get your thoughts, Rich, on whether you think it came with the blessing of Sky yesterday, the Froome statement. It was released on his website, not the Sky website.
That's an interesting question, Daniel. The last time I remember Chris Froome issuing a statement like that, it was in response to some of Bradley Wiggins' comments about wanting to ride the Tour, and there was a sort of that was last year, wasn't it? It was around the time of when Froome was obviously expecting to go into the Tour as team leader, and Bradley Wiggins was riding the Giro. It was actually his press conference before the Giro where he said he fancied doing the double, and within sort of hours there was quite an angry, certainly strongly worded statement from Chris Froome just saying that he understood that he was leader and he would appreciate the full support and backing of Team Sky. And Team Sky followed a few days later with a statement from Dave Brailsford confirming that he would be leading the team, and that was him certainly acting alone. And it, as you say, the statement appeared on his own website. It seemed to be coming from him rather than the team.
Rogue, isn't he?
I think there is. I mean, I think. I mean, it sort of generated a story, by not being there. He was still the sort of main story in the British press. Will Froome miss the Tour? And from that point of view, it generates a bit of debate, discussion. It creates a story that wouldn't otherwise. There probably wouldn't have been much coverage of the Tour presentation in Great Britain actually without that story. But I do think it's hot air. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't see Team Sky even contemplating entertaining for a second the idea that their strongest rider and their only potential winner misses the Tour. It's just not going to happen.
I also think in terms of the way the race organisers have the complete right to design the route that they see fit. Their business is to try and make the races entertaining as they possibly can, and I think but by the same token a rider is perfectly entitled to express their dissatisfaction with the route if they feel it doesn't suit their physical attributes. But in terms of kind of trying to sell races to a broader public, the Giro and the Vuelta, certainly in England, in Britain, are a lot lower level in terms of media interest, television coverage, even audience figures than the Tour de France is. But it did sort of leap out at me when Chris Froome said how attractive the Giro looked with its 60-kilometre time trial. I mean, I look at that as a spectator, as a rest day, really, a chance to have a snooze on the sofa.
Yeah, but he's looking at it with a slightly different perspective.
But we're talking, without summing up US marketing guy here, we're talking about making races that the public want to watch, and it's if we're going to say, well, if we're going to have
Chris Froome's not interested in races the public wants to watch.
I know he's not
in winning.
I know he's not, but we don't need to come to blows over it, Richard, here. But in terms of Sky's business is, yes, winning races, but also if part of their mission is to make cycling more popular and become more of a major sport, having 60-kilometre time or any time trials is not the way to do it. Perhaps leave this now and move on. My point on time trialling is not a secret.
You've made your point. I think the interesting thing, maybe it's interesting, I don't know, maybe we've talked about this too much already, but Chris Froome is not somebody who, as we know, grew up following the Tour de France, and perhaps for him there will be a bit more pragmatism in the decision. Perhaps I don't think Team Sky will allow him to ride the Giro and the Vuelta instead of the Tour, but from his point of view, perhaps he, without being steeped in sort of cycling lore and history, and without having grown up dreaming of winning the Tour de France, perhaps from a sporting point of view and from a pragmatic point of view, he looks at the Giro and the Vuelta and thinks, I've got more chance of winning them, I'd rather ride them. Perhaps. I don't think it'll happen, but that might be where he's coming from.
The Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Interviews and analysis, we've got the big talking points covered.
You mentioned the eventuality of someone like Froome going for 2 Grand Tours yesterday. We've already talked, I think, about Tinkov's 3-tour challenge, but I've been doing a bit of interviewing about that, various people this week, physiologists mainly, team physiologists, talking about, is it possible to contend for all 3? Pretty much everyone says it's not. Everyone, in fact, is unanimous in saying that it's not. And the consensus seems to be that you would need about 8 weeks, I think, between Grand Tours to get back onto top form. There are about 8 weeks between the Giro and the Vuelta, but of course if you throw in the Tour de France it's pretty much impossible. Just on Nibali as well, Rich, in Paris yesterday he gave various interviews, spoke about Astana, spoke about Astana's credibility, spoke about his future with Astana. Now Nibali's contract is up at the end of 2016. Fabio Aru's contract is also up at the end of 2016, but there is the suggestion that Astana want him to renew the contract, Nibali, to 2020, which would pretty much take him to the end of his career. He's 29 now. There's talk of a 15 million euros offer. They might even want him to put pen to paper on that in November when there's going to be a meeting. I would suggest that he will not do that for various reasons. I think one, he's quite concerned about the UCI investigation into Astana following the 3 positive tests, or certainly 2 positive tests by the Iglinski brothers and the other stagiaire. Also, I understand that he's not very happy Astana didn't offer a contract to his brother Antonio, who is turning professional with the Nippo. I always get these teams mixed up. It's not. It's the team that Damiano Cunego's joined, kind of Italo-Japanese team. And apparently his father is not very happy either that Astana didn't offer a contract to Nibali. He's also very good friends with Valerio Agnoli, who was not selected for the Tour team this year at Vinokurov's request. Vinokurov didn't think he was strong enough. Agnoli's wife and Nibali's wife are very, very good friends as well. So there's a little bit of sort of personal discontent as regards the management and some of the decisions that they've taken this year. So I think that Nibali will probably hold fire on that contract offer if it does materialise.
I wonder if that contract offer, and that tying up Nibali, who's one of the sort of crown jewels of the sport, on a long-term deal is almost a move by Astana to curry favour with the UCI as they embark on this investigation. Do they exclude a team with one of those big 4 Grand Tour riders? Not that necessarily will or certainly should come into the UCI's thinking, but it might just be we've talked a lot about how the sport is desperate for big money sponsors. Astana are a big money sponsor. They put an awful lot into the sport from that point of view, and that's them committing in principle to back a team up to 2020. And I think there was a sort of their expos in 2017, isn't it? And there was maybe a suggestion that Astana might, who've already been involved for quite a long time, might only hang around until after that. So yeah, it might just be part of the PR a PR exercise in that respect as well. But interesting, and the 3 positive drugs tests for Astana have certainly been a big talking point the last couple of weeks. We've been asked a lot about it on Twitter through the @cycling_podcast Twitter account that we have. I think people are alarmed and troubled by the fact that the team of the winner of the Tour has had such a sort of checkered recent past. Lionel's nodding. That doesn't really come across. I know that you're Sean Kelly's ghostwriter, Lionel, and I know that he famously nods to questions on the radio, but We're not going to accept that on the podcast, I'm afraid. You're going to have to say something, even if you're a US marketing guy.
Well, we're running out of time a little bit here, but it's something we'll have to return to in future episodes, I think. But just in brief, the UCI need to show a strong hand of leadership here. They need to make it very clear that 3 positive tests, 2 brothers, they might be able to say, well, they're isolated, they were acting alone, but then a stagiaire as well in the Tour de l'Avenir. I mean, it just doesn't look. It looks like there's a very lax hand on what's going on at the Espana team, and that has to lie with the management, and the management need to be taken to held to account, taken to task by the governing body on that. You can't just allow. What if there's another positive test in the early part of next year and then another one? The team has to be given some kind of sanction, I think, and certainly some kind of warning that there's a sort of traffic light system where they may well have to sort of surrender their World Tour license if they don't get this in order.
US marketing guy would probably say it's 3 strikes and you're out, dude, wouldn't he? If he's a baseball fan.
I mean, the thing is that the team has to accept responsibility, but at the same time, these teams have sort of 30 riders. Riders can act alone, and if 1 rider can act alone, 3 riders can act alone. It doesn't necessarily suggest a pattern in the Iglinski family, perhaps, but it's a hard one, that, because I'm saying something quite contradictory there. I'm saying that the team does have to accept responsibility, but at the same time we have to acknowledge as well that riders can act alone, and it doesn't necessarily reflect on the team, on any kind of policy that the team has. Can I just move this swiftly along? Daniel, why are you looking at me like that?
No. There's one thing we need to mention before we go.
Lance Armstrong.
Oh, there's that as well, and there's the London Sports Writing Festival, Super Sunday.
Yeah.
This Sunday, Lords, London. If this podcast gets out in time, we're hoping it will. Yeah,
that's Sunday the 26th of October. Daniel and I are both doing events at Lords, the London Sports Writing Festival. I'm talking about my book, A Tap, with Max Leonard talking about his book Lanterne Rouge, and Tim Moore talking about his book Geronimo. And Daniel, you're appearing with Christophe Basson. Your event is at 3 o'clock, something like that. Mine's at 8 o'clock in the evening, so please come along.
And the cycling anthology's there as well. Ellis Bacon, my co-editor on that, will be chairing the cycling anthology slot, which from memory is I think 12:30, more or less kicks things off early afternoon.
Right, briefly, Lance Armstrong back in the news. Interesting piece on Velo News, because he's taking part in George Hincapie's Gran Fondo ride this weekend. Is he taking part? Has there been some kind of... did I see something that USADA are trying to stop him riding or something? It's not a sort of sporting event. It's not a race, so I'm not sure how that can happen. Anyway, the real discussion has been around the reuniting of former US Postal teammates Christian van der Velde, Michael Barry, George Hincapie, Lance Armstrong, but also the participation in the event of a few younger riders, including TJ Van Garderen, who's the sort of the big American Grand Tour hope, and was certainly up there in contention for the podium at the Tour de France this year. Now, Van Garderen wrote a very interesting email to Velo News talking about his relationship with Armstrong, and said in it that he'd been seeing quite a lot of him. They're near neighbours in Aspen, and he's even been out motor pacing with him. Now, Van Garderen has always been pretty eloquent and articulate on the subject of doping. He has come through in the last few years. And he made some interesting points without reading the whole thing out. He did make some interesting points about his view that Armstrong has paid a far bigger price than anybody else, and the need to sort of move on. I don't know. What do you think, Lionel?
Well, I haven't read that. I read the original piece about Armstrong taking part in the Gran Fondo, and it's a George Hincapie Gran Fondo, isn't it? So that he's part of the same generation, part of the same problem. I think it's inevitable that those guys, there will still be, as I think Daniel, you made the point, there will still be plenty of people who would tear your arm off for the chance to ride with Lance Armstrong. He is the US marketing guy's dream, because he still has a market, he still has an audience, he still has plenty of supporters, plenty of people who don't care. My personal opinion is different to that, and if I were TJ Van Garderen, I probably wouldn't associate with him, because I would be concerned about the the shadow that might cast on it. Certainly makes it harder for Van Garderen if anything were to happen in his team with a teammate, or if there were to be a doping scandal in the Tour de France when he's taking part, competing for the podium. It makes it harder for him to make a strong, strident stand when people can just throw at him, well, you've been motor pacing with Lance Armstrong. And for that reason, now that might mean you shouldn't allow things like that to choose who you work with, choose who your friends are. If Van Garderen, I'm assuming he's not going to Lance Armstrong for doping advice, so he's free to choose all of his acquaintances and friends. Fine, but nevertheless there will be an association drawn and an impression given.
Yeah, if I was giving advice to TJ Van Garderen, that's the advice I would give him. Nevertheless, I thought his explanation in his email was quite nuanced, and certainly it wasn't an association he was trying to hide or pretend didn't exist. I mean, Andrew Talansky is friendly with Levi Leipheimer, but maybe I suggest that because he rides for Garmin Sharp, he's sort of immune to any sort of critical comment over that, it seems, and that's a problem as well, I think. I mean, where do you draw the line? I mean, TJ Van Garderen rides for BMC, a team that's owned by Andy Rees, who did own the Phonak team, where Jim Okovich, who's certainly got an interesting past, he's obviously in charge there as well. So we can't. I think the point that Van Garderen was making is relevant here. That we cannot sort of put Armstrong, and I think this is a mistake that has been made, in a different category. I think they all belong to the same category, and you can't have Vino. You can't have Vino and not Armstrong. You can't have Bjarne Riis and not Lance Armstrong, in a sense. Why should TJ Van Garderen be put against a wall for motor pacing with Lance Armstrong when Alberto Contador is in a team directed by Bjarne Riis?
Absolutely, I completely agree with you on that, and it's where really the debate that the point I would have taken 5, 6, 7 years ago of kind of trying to have some kind of zero tolerance so that there would not be a place in the sport for people like Bjarne Riis. We wouldn't be having perhaps this discussion now, because the line would have been drawn a lot more clearly, and we would know who are the fit and proper people to work in cycling and who aren't.
Live news. I've just been sent pictures of Orla Chenouille, a friend of the podcast and regular on the podcast, with her little baby daughter, who's just been born today. There we are. This doesn't really work all that well on the podcast, but nevertheless, let's celebrate that moment. Congratulations, Orla, if you're listening. You probably will be, because you've got some time on your hands now.
Yeah, just final point on that. I mean, I agree with both of you that you can't. It is slightly hypocritical to suggest that riding for a team managed by Bjarne Riis is okay and being motivated by Lance Armstrong isn't. The fact is that it is how a lot of people that feel, or that are the standards that are adopted by a lot of people. And if TJ Van Garderen is being pragmatic about it, he has to acknowledge that some people will not be particularly impressed by him spending time with Lance Armstrong, and he has to assume the consequences of his actions. I'm sure his email might win a handful of people over, but the majority of the people we've seen opinions with Lance Armstrong tend to be pretty entrenched, and the majority of the people who would prefer him not to spend time with Lance Armstrong will continue to feel that way. I wonder,
maybe at some point we'll do a special with Lance Armstrong. I'm sure he'll agree to that, given our relationship with him. I wonder, just let us know on Twitter whether you would be interested in hearing an Armstrong special. Might be several years down the line, I don't know, but that'd be an interesting one. You're going to play golf with him, no, Daniel.
I would like to.
You would like to?
Yeah.
Doper. Anyway, right.
Against him.
Oh, against him. That's all right then. Right.
Not with him. I wouldn't partner up with him.
Okay, I'm glad we got that clear. Anyway, thank you very much, Lionel.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
The Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Subscribe on iTunes, listen on Audioboo, visit us at thecyclingpodcast.com.